Over my short career of maybe 4 or 5 years in the games industry, I've had the opportunity to work at a ton of different companies. And in slightly over 10 internships, I've learned a lot that's going to be informing all the future projects I work on within my career. I wanted to take this time to reflect on some of the awesome jobs I've had the opportunity to work on and some of the key takeaways that I've brought with me along the way. Starting with Sony Santa Monica on the God of War team. So when I was working on this team, it was slightly after they had shipped God of War of 2016. And there was this certain mantra that I heard a few times that really resonated with me, which was all 8s make a 10. I thought this was, well, first of all, right, it's just like the math doesn't work, right? The idea is that if you can think of a game in different attributes, where there's music, where there's UI, where there's combat, all of these attributes could be independently scored. So for example, when IGN gets your game and they have that review copy, they're going to say, 5 out of 10 UI, 6 out of 10 combat. And they're going to be ranking all these different attributes. But the secret to getting a 10, and as you may know, God of War went on to win Game of the Year and a lot of awards, so these guys probably know a thing or two about making that 10. The secret was that you didn't need a 10 in all categories. You just needed to make sure none of your categories fell below an 8. And so that's kind of where this mantra comes from, this idea of all 8s make a 10. It's this idea that was pertinent to that project, at least what I had learned because I didn't work on it directly, but this idea that if the UI was really bad and it was dragging the entire project, we need to get that UI to an 8 before we worry about anything else, because that 8 is going to be more important than getting, combat from a 9 to a 10. We need at least everything to get to that 8. Hence the mantra, all 8s make a 10. It's a really awesome insight, and it reminds me back to, I thought really deeply about this in gym class in high school, when one of my teachers, the gym teacher, said to me that professional baseball players, some of them are really good pitchers, but really bad at batting. And that's kind of amazing because it suggests this idea that you could be part of a team and a really valued member in some respects, but in others, you might not be the best. And so the idea is, hey, if you're really incredible at one thing, just make sure you don't really suck at these other things, and then people will be able to focus on your strengths rather than being focused on your weaknesses. And with all 8s, there's no weakness to focus on, so to speak. So God of War, interesting studio, right? This was a studio that was not very collaborative. It's very much closer to the auteur kind of design that we've seen in the recent screenplay versus gameplay that I did with Neil Druckmann's Naughty Dog's The Last of Us. So it's a very different atmosphere than this other studio I worked at, which was Hangar 13 2K Games. And so in Hangar 13, it was a very different approach, and that's also respective of what part we were within the life cycle of this project. I joined very early on the prototyping stage of their next, hopefully, AAA hit. And one of their mantras that stuck with me was, we can have anything, but not everything. This was a studio that, under 2K and the Take-Two umbrella, they had a lot of resources. This was a studio that if they wanted to have, amazing AAA graphics, amazing audio, they could have that. If they wanted a, world that allowed for you to do X, Y, and Z, then they could have that as well. However, they couldn't have everything in the game at the same time. And so this was, I think, a really important mantra to remember, especially when you're in an area where you might have affordances to pursue stuff that might be expensive, especially in a AAA environment. It's this idea that we could do anything, but we can't do everything. We really should focus on what is it that we want to do and explore our ideas around that focus. And that's something I'm going to carry with me, I think, to my future projects as well. And then I had an opportunity to speak with the game director for a moment. We went out for tacos, which was amazing because I rarely get that ability to talk with someone at that level. And so I was very grateful that he gave me his time. And one of the things that he explained to me was, and he had a military background, he explained that generals in the Army are generalists. And I never realized the significance of that naming, but it's so true. The more you become a leader, someone who's managing others, the less you need to know about a specific niche area, and the more you're expected to kind of be a generalist, be responsible for overseeing what many different people are doing, perhaps across several different disciplines. Someone like a CEO is not an expert at graphics engineering, right? Or maybe they could be if that's, what their discipline was, where they came from. But the idea is that a general is in many ways a generalist, and I think that's a really powerful idea. Following that, I wanted to talk about Manticore Games. So this is an internship I did quite recently on a startup which is working on building a digital playground for modern games. And one of the things that stuck with me was what a designer said to me. He said that designers, their job is not to come up with great ideas. And I think a lot of people believe that, right? We've talked about the idea guy in the games industry, someone who has all the ideas. And often designers are put into that light, which is that the designer has to come up with the ideas. But in reality, as this person explained to me, that's not the case. A designer isn't responsible for coming up with the best ideas. They're responsible for aggregating those ideas, wherever they may come from. And I really like that idea, as a designer is in charge of sort of soliciting or aggregating all of the best ideas from other team members and finding ways to put that into the game. In many ways, they're not the generator of ideas, they're the funnel of ideas. And I think that's a really important paradigm to carry forward with me in my career. Second to that was, and this is something that the CEO, Frederick, said, and I love Frederick very much, and he often has great takes. And so he said that communities are always going to be dragged towards the sewer. And that's really stuck with me. So this idea that when you create an online community, you have sometimes a very slim window of time that you could define what that community is about. What are the norms? What's expected of members of the community? Is it going to be accepting of people from all different walks of life, like 4chan, which, Fred would probably call the sewer, a place where really things that are inappropriate and that we wouldn't want to monetize go? Or is it going to be pristine, super clean? You don't even see the janitor because they're walking underground. Disney World. You've got Disney World on one hand, you've got 4chan on the other hand. And what Frederick observed is that when you launch an online community, you can put those tent poles in, you can put those expectations. But if 4chan is here and Disney World is here, no matter where you put your tent poles, you're going to get dragged towards 4chan. And so that's why it's really important when you're setting up the community, you choose where along that axis you want to start, with the expectation you're going to be dragged towards the sewers, as he would say. And he says it in his lovely French accent. But I think that paradigm is something I've really been thinking about when I think about online communities and what's the culture I want to spawn. You have to be aware that when you open it up, the floodgates, when you open it up to chat and emotes and stuff like this, it's always going to go in that direction. So if you want to keep it over here, you got to start it way over here. And it's just something to keep in mind. The next internship that I wanted to reflect on was Tilting Point. So Tilting Point was a little bit different for me because normally I'm interning as an engineer, but this was an opportunity for me to really explore in depth to engage with design. And not only that, but it's a publisher. So while I typically work in development studios like God of War, for example, this was a studio that was working on supporting games. And I learned a lot about myself in that process. For example, I learned that I like making games rather than supporting other teams making games. And I have a better idea of where my role is within the industry because of that. But one of the key takeaways I walked away from that project with was actually a design goal. And we were working on this game called Pool Elite, which is a game that was originally on Facebook and then they moved it onto mobile. And what I realized was this is a free-to-play game with strong pay-to-win mechanics, right? This is a game where you could put some money in from your PayPal or credit card, and you could have a way better pool queue, which is in many ways, determining how powerful you are in the game. If you got a great queue, you're way better off. But what I realized was that, and it's very subtle, if you're going to have pay-to-win strategies, in order to make the game still satisfying and to make it feel like you could still succeed, all you have to do is ensure that the top tier, in this case the queue, right, the pool queue, the best queue that you could get in the game cannot be purchased. And so what Pool Elite does, and it's very similar to what 8-Ball Pool does, is you've got queues that you can earn from skill, and you've got queues that you can earn from purchases, in-app purchases. And it's important that within a tier and within the game itself, you always make sure that those skill queues are the number one queues. And so what that allows is a really great ecosystem where you can have somebody jump up the leaderboard because they made a payment, but it prevents them from getting to the number one spot. And so you can jump up a little bit and feel like, wow, I have this tremendous power because I just put in my money and now I'm reaping the rewards of that transaction. However, you're not the king just by paying, okay? And I think that's really the secret to not having your game feel pay to win in a bad way. And it's a very difficult balance, and as we know, free-to-play games are some of the hardest games to develop because you have to consider so many other moving factors at the same time. But I think that's one of the key secrets in order to making it work. So now let's talk about Zynga, which was an unannounced project I worked on. And it never shipped and it probably never will. But one of the key takeaways I took out of that project was that the time to implement almost always matters more than the big O notation space-time complexity. So when you're in college, or when I was in college, one of the big things they rammed into my skull was this space-time complexity analysis. Whenever you write a piece of code, you're looking at your algorithm and you're determining how fast is it and how much space is it going to need to run. So for example, certain sorting algorithms are going to take less space, but they might be able to perform slightly faster, right? And so this is where we start talking about big O notation, n time, logarithmic time, stuff like that. And what I realized working on this team was that for the vast majority of cases, it doesn't matter the big O notation as much as it matters the time to implement. Because often we're working on these, rapid iteration cycles, at least within the case of this, prototyping project, where at the end of the day, this code might not even be shipped to production. We need to focus on if it's fun. And so if you can implement an algorithm that's 100 times slower, but takes you 5 minutes to code, versus an algorithm that's, way fast, but it's going to take a full hour or maybe a few hours of your day to code that, go with the fast algorithm, find out if it's fun, and then you can, optimize it later. And this is especially true in video games where we often have what's called a critical path, which is the code is going to hit this part every single frame. That's a very small percent of the code, right? People often reference the 80-20 principle, which is that 20% of the code is going to take up 80% of the runtime. And so that small percent of the code, we really need to worry about performance there. But if this code is queued to like a user input action, so for example, this is code that runs when you push a button, well, that could easily take, milliseconds to run, and people wouldn't care because it's responding to a button press. And so in that case, it really doesn't matter that much what your big O notation is, even if you're like orders of magnitude of complexity off from what the optimal algorithm would be. If you're going to get that code out of the door faster and we're going to learn something like, oh shit, we're never going to ship this game, so all your work was wasted anyway, well then god damn it, it's a good time you didn't spend half your internship optimizing this code for something that's never going to ship. So I think that was a huge takeaway for me, maybe a little bit of spite at the same time, but it's like, damn, focus on what's going to ship, focus on what matters. And very rarely I found, in a very small percent of the code, is that actually going to be the runtime performance. So something to keep in mind, especially for gameplay engineers, where we're not always working at that low level. A gameplay engineer very often will jump into some high-level code, maybe even working with scripting, with designers. And so, when you're at that level, you have to really be conscious of whether or not it's worth your time to optimize every little function. A really key point there. The next job I wanted to talk about was Facebook on Facebook Spaces, which is a VR project. Now, I wasn't a VR junkie before I started, and I definitely learned that I wasn't a VR junkie going after this internship. I think when you work at a company like Oculus, and you have every single VR game on Oculus available to you for free to play, you realize how much you really want to play them. And for me, it wasn't that much. I played maybe a few, and then I realized, they're all free, but I don't even like this medium. And I think that was a big takeaway in itself, learning, where I want to make my impact in the industry. If I can say, wow, VR maybe it's not for me, that's a huge win, and it's going to save me a lot of time in figuring out what are the projects I want to focus my time on. But even more powerful than that was the takeaway of finding the right metric. And so when I was working at Facebook, I remember distinctly there was this meeting where we all squished into this room, and one of the leads for the team, Michael Booth, he says to us, we could focus on many different things for this project, right? We could focus on how long is a user playing our game. Or we could focus on how many users are playing our game. And all these different metrics are not always in agreement, right? So you can over-optimize for one of those metrics versus another. And in a big company like Facebook, you really have to worry about what are the incentivization structures you're putting in place for your team. And they really placed a priority on figuring out what is the best metric for this game. When we look at this game and we're looking at the analytics to figure out if we're making improvements, if we're heading in the right direction, what is the metric that's going to be our guiding light? So often in free-to-play games especially, we're looking at the retention mechanics of 40-20-10, right? This is the gold standard. 40% retention on day 1, 20% retention on day 7, and day 30, 10% retention day 30. These are sort of, arbitrary, admittedly, but the gold standard of what we're looking for in like the ideal game in order to keep our audience engaged. But it's important that we don't take that metric for granted. There's so many ways that we can measure how effectively our game is communicating whatever we're trying to communicate, how effectively that experience is coming to the player. And so we should always be considering what is the metric we're using to evaluate the game's validity, and is that the right metric for the game? So that was a key insight for me coming from Facebook. Another takeaway from Facebook was this idea of committing code every single day. And I found that kind of hard. And, I'm still a junior in my career. I find that extremely hard even today to code a diff every single day. But I think it's a really good guideline in order to make sure that you're providing impact and you're providing a positive, feedback and you're moving the team forward every single day. And I think a diff per day as sort of a paradigm, as sort of a mantra, is a really powerful way to do that. And so, it might be called a commit or Facebook always calls them diffs, but I think that's a really powerful message to be saying that you're making a diff per day on the team. And so it's definitely something I'm not going to forget. I wanted to talk now about my work for the FIP. This is the International Pharmaceutical Federation. So this is a team that I contributed to when I was in high school. This was one of the first big software projects I worked on. And wow, I learned so much from this project as I matured from high school student to college student. I think in this one summer, due to the emotional turmoil I went through, due to this project and some other stuff that was happening in my life, I may have matured like 2 years in age. It was a lot, and I was rewarded for that with a lot of accolades. And so, for these I did some science fairs with my research, and these organizations flew me to different parts of the country. I even got to present my work in Dublin, Ireland. And it was a lot of fanfare. It was a lot of excitement. And I remember very distinctly my mom saying to me, "Matthew, enjoy this while it lasts. But I want you to be very cognizant of something. If you were an adult and this were your job, no one would give a shit about what you've accomplished. And that's because if you were just doing your job, they'd say that guy was just doing his job." And as sad as that might sound, that was incredibly liberating for me as a young person who was kind of thrown into the limelight by surprise. I realized just how much I needed to take all this appreciation for granted. If someone was giving me an interview or something for media or a newspaper or a TV show or something, I just kept in the back of my mind that this is awesome. This is an achievement, but a huge part of this is it's contextualized to where I am in my life right now. If I was a professional in the field, then this wouldn't have been as like impressive. And I think that's important to say. And I guess at the end of the day, it's this idea of being humble. And I think it was the learnings that I took from that project that really helped me get through the crazy success that No Stranger had 2 years later. When I made this game, No Stranger, it blew up. It was crazy. We had over 1 million downloads. And this was my first indie game, right? That's insane. And I know it's insane because I've seen developers go through this like crippling depression after they make a game that powerful. For example, there's this amazing essay by Davey Wreden that I've read at least 5 times called Game of the Year. And I'll see if I remember to put it in the comments section. But this is an amazing essay that talks about what it's like. The depression of success, in many ways, is the idea. And it's a weird thing, right? Because nobody wants to hear about somebody who's sad that they won the award, right? It's a silly thing. It's oxymoronic. However, there is a crippling sensation that happens when you experience this great success. It's very akin to this idea of, oh shit, I've peaked, right? Like, oh shit, I'm never going to make something more impactful than this again. And I think learning how to deal with that is really important. So let's talk about Black Vein Productions. This is not a company I interned for, I'll admit. But when I worked on my FIP software, one of the things that I found really difficult was just the gravity of the work. This idea that people were going to use it and it could very well save a life, or it could very well not work, so to speak, right? And that was really tough for me, and it was kind of one of the things that said to me in the back of my mind, oh, you know what, maybe medical software isn't my passion, because maybe the stakes are a little too high. And that's something I've matured on, certainly, but I was excited to get into entertainment, partially because I've always thought entertainment is a little bit, silly and maybe useless, and maybe making a video game is, pedantic in such a way that it's like, hey, you know what, if I make this game and it absolutely sucks, then it's not hurting anyone, and that's okay. And Jonathan Blow has some nice dissents on that, but One of the things that stuck with me was when I was working with my co-founder, Scott Mulligan. I expressed to him that we're making a game that's not going to be saving lives. And he said something to me that, in the way Scott is, he'll often have these little bouts of profound madness. And he said to me, Matthew, we're not trying to save lives. We're giving people a reason to live. We're giving people something to live for. And wow, that struck me. It's something I've never forgotten. It's such a powerful idea because I think it brings a gravity to entertainment. It brings a gravity to work that is, in every other, time that I think about it, it's silly. It's making a game. It's some, silly game that you play where you wiggle your finger in the middle of a subway, right? But if that brings someone enjoyment, that can be incredibly powerful. And we've heard, and I won't share anything directly, but we've heard amazing stories from fans of ours who've spoken to the experiences they've had playing our game, and we've actually had people email us saying things along the lines of, hey, I was planning to make a really destructive decision, and in some cases that was ending their own life, and they said, because of this game and how it's touched me, I've decided to not do that. And that's incredible. And because so little people have actually used my FIP software in practice, I'm pretty sure, I may have saved more lives with my silly video game than with my actual software that was meant to save lives. And that just, that blew my mind. That was insane as a thought. And it made me really proud of what I made. And I take a lot of the stuff that I make really seriously. Even when it's silly, I take it seriously in the only way that you can. But I'll never forget that. And I think it's really important to find people on your team who empathize at the same level that you do. And so if you feel you're making work that's really important, I think you need to have people on the team who empathize with that. Otherwise, I think that's a discontinuity that can lead to problems. And so I think it was really valuable that me and Scott were on the same wavelength there. He brought me over to his side after sharing that. Let's talk about NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So this was before I was making games. I was making waves. That's right. We're talking about ocean waves, El Nino, and also studying coronal mass ejections. I did a lot of research at NASA. I worked there for 2 internships, actually, consecutive summers, maybe 3. And what I learned was, I think, to summarize it in a sentence, I learned the value of how much you can learn from failure. A lot of my projects were not incredibly successful. We didn't have a project coming out of my research team that went all the way. We were very grateful to have one of our posters presented at the American Geophysical Union, the AGU. However, for the most part, our research didn't make huge waves. And I think despite that, we learned a lot. And often, and I think this kind of sucks, especially in academia, it is squished in such a way that it's like, if you haven't made this significant learning, then hey, you know what? Maybe you suck. And I think NASA, at least these jobs, they taught me that, you know what? You can learn just as much and you can make just as much of an impact with a failure as you can from a huge success. And this is definitely a tangent, but there's a interesting research study where there's a standard in research of a certain percent of statistical significance, which if you don't hit it, it's like, hey, we're not going to publish. I forget what it is. It might be, it's a certain percentage point, right? And it's crazy because when you look at all the papers that have ever been published, it's like a giant hill to that percentage point, in this idea that wow, everybody is just, fucking the data wiggling the data in such a way that they could get it to that percentage point just so they could publish. And I think it speaks to like how problematic modern academic research is, if for better or worse, right? Certainly for worse. There's a lot of problems there, but I think man, academic research wasn't for me, and that's another thing NASA taught me. Okay, let's wrap it up. The last internship, Iron Tiger at NCSoft. So I worked on a game which was canceled. And I think one of the problems with this game, I don't know, I mean, I'm just an intern, don't look at me. But I think one of the problems about this game was the game wasn't fun. And one of the reasons I could tell the game wasn't fun is because nobody played the game for fun. I remember every lunch, right? What is it? 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. All the engineers would get together and go online to their Steam accounts to play this game called PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, PUBG. It had just come out at the time. Huge success. Would later spawn this game called Fortnite, which is actually the company I'm going to be working for in like just a few months. But I think that's a huge sign when your team is not playing the game. This was also the case on a team I worked very closely on when I was at Zynga. And I think it's really important, especially as a leader in your team, to make sure your game is fun. And that's the hardest thing, right? Making a game that's fun or entertaining or delivering whatever the objective is you're seeking. But I think a telltale sign, and this is something I'll carry with me, a telltale sign of there being a problem is people don't even want to play it. And I don't think you could get a bigger red flag than that. So these were about 10 internships and everything I've learned from them. It's been an incredible ride so far, and I'm embarking soon on what should be my last internship in the industry, which may well have been my, I think, 14th internship overall. But I'm really excited to have found a niche, have found what I'm passionate about within this industry in such a way that I could hopefully dive into it into full-time opportunities and continue to learn these lessons for many years to come. Thanks for listening, and I hope one or two of these takeaways you'll bring with you in your career. If any of them stood out to you, please let me know in the comments section below, or if there was perhaps a learning that you took away from a certain internship or job that you'd like to share. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much.